In our last installment, we touched upon the Battle of Marathon, which in turn lead us to the modern Olympic Games. This prompted a query from a discerning listener: what, precisely, is the story behind the Olympics? A fine question. The modern Olympic Games, or the Summer Olympics, as they are formally known, do indeed, as most of us know, trace their lineage to ancient Hellas. But here lies a common misconception. Those not intimately acquainted with Hellenic history might assume the Games are a product of Athens. After all, Athens was the greatest of the city-states, and they were certainly not averse to organizing the odd sporting festival to pass the time. But, in reality, the Olympic Games is a rather literal translation. They were, quite simply, the Games of Olympia, and Olympia was a place unto itself. While it was certainly within the Hellenic cultural sphere, it was a veritable world away from Athens. We speak of Sparta and Athens on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, gazing at each other across the Saronic Gulf. Well, Olympia was further still, nestled on the peninsula's westernmost edge, a far more distant relation than even Sparta. It belonged to a region known as Hellas. In its earliest days, the hamlet of Olympia wasn't even called that. Its original name is lost to us, but we do know that its inhabitants, men, women, old, and young, were a people steeped in a devout superstition. They subscribed wholeheartedly to the prevailing mythology of the Hellenic Peninsula, the belief that the highest peak in the land, Mount Olympus, was the residence of a dozen divine personages, a celestial management team, whose names are familiar to this day: Zeus, king of the gods, his formidable wife, Hera his daughter, the wisdom-dispensing Athena his sister, the love goddess Aphrodite, the sun god Apollo, and so on and so forth. And for this reason alone, these people grandly named their home Olympia. This, despite the rather inconvenient fact that their rustic settlement was a staggering distance from the actual Mount Olympus. The mountain stands in the northeast of the Balkan Peninsula, and that village lay in the far west of the Peloponnese. It was a connection more aspirational than actual. This geographical discrepancy, however, did nothing to dampen their piety. And they were not alone. The entire city-state of Hellas was known for its fervent worship of the Olympian pantheon. So much so that, by the 9th century before the Common Era, the king of Athens, a fellow named Epictetus, came to a conclusion. He felt that his kingdom's solitary reverence was simply not enough. To truly demonstrate sincerity, one must encourage others to join in the worship. Thus, one morning, Epictetus arose, seized by a rather sudden and divinely inspired caprice. He announced that he had received a sacred oracle. What oracle, you ask? He claimed the gods had whispered to him in a dream. They had commanded him to establish a truce with LISS rivals, the Spartans, and to map his truce with a repairing athletic competition to be held on certain holy days. These would be known as the Olympic Games. And during this period, all hostilities were to cease. Everyone was to be at peace. Now, the Spartans, a people of immense muscle, had this and, rather surprisingly, agreed. Their reasoning was twofold. First, whether the gods had truly spoken was debatable. But what if they had? There was no sense in offending the divine powers. Second, They viewed athletic competition as just another form of warfare. And in any contest of sinew, the Spartans feared no one, and so it was. In the year 880 per BCE, is as Sparta ratified the sacred truce. It stipulated that once a year, athletic contests would be held at Olympia. During the games, not only was warfare forbidden, but no man was permitted to bear arms within Olympia's sacred precincts. Furthermore, no one could impede an athlete on his journey. Violators, it was understood, would face divine retribution of a most unpleasant and terminal nature. Initially, there was but a single event of foot race. The length was 192.27 meters, a distance the Hellenes called a stadion. And yes, it is from this very word that our modern stadium is derived. Gradually, the program expanded to include boxing, wrestling, the discus, the javelin, and more. Participation swelled to encompass the entire Hellenic world. The Athenians were particularly enthusiastic. They even decreed that any victor, regardless of his prior station, would immediately be granted the high honor of Athenian citizenship. Immediately. It is perhaps this very enthusiasm that has led so many to mistakenly credit Athens with the whole affair, when in fact, the city-state of was the true originator. The first games, for which we have written records, took place in 776 BCE. They certainly existed before then, just on a smaller, unrecorded scale. From that year forward, for the next 1,070 years, the Hellenes, regardless of who ruled them, steadfastly maintained this tradition. It was only in 393 CE that the games were finally abolished. The Roman Emperor Theodosius I, having established Christianity as the state religion, put a stop to them. And why? Because the great emperor deemed that a festival paying homage to the Olympian gods was an activity fundamentally at odds with the spirit of Christianity. So, in a rather direct sense, the God of Abraham defeated the gods of Olympus. The ancient Olympic Games were snuffed out by a rival religion. It was not until the modern era, through the tireless efforts of the French-educated Baron Pierre de Coubertin, that the Games were revived in 1896. The International Olympic Committee was formed, and it was decreed they would be held every 4 years. To this day, 32 such games have been held. Of course, the modern iteration is stripped of its overt pagan worship. Its stated purpose now is the noble, if somewhat optimistic, cause of world peace. Reflecting upon this history, to ironies present themselves with a particular sharpness. First, the ancient games, born of religious fervor, were ultimately cancelled due to the ascendancy of another religion. And second, the modern games, founded on the principle of peace and the cessation of conflict, have themselves been cancelled on 3 occasions by the rather inconvenient outbreak of the First and Second World Wars. The predictable absurdity of it all would surely make even the gods of Olympus smirk. But let us return to our main narrative. We mention that after the First Greco-Persian War, the Persians returned defeated. A decade passed. In 480 BCE, Xerxes I, successor to Darius the Great, decided it was time for a second attempt. He returned, and he returned in force, leading a host of some 30 myriad soldiers and a fleet of 1,000 warships to once again invade Hellas. This time, the scale of the invasion sent a shockwave of alarm and panic through every Hellenic city-state. It was obvious to all that this was no mere punitive expedition against Athens. The very existence of Hellas was on the line. Almost without a call to arms, the Hellenes united. Sparta, this time, did not quibble over gains and losses, nor did it pause for festivals. It took the lead, commanding the allied land forces, while Athens took charge of the navy. Xerxes' strategy mirrored that of his predecessor, two-pronged assault by land and sea, with the army marching south from the north. The historian Herodotus, in his histories, claims the Persian army numbered 7 million, but this is clearly an exaggeration. In reality, the force advancing from the north was likely around 100,000 men. Given the terrain of the time, the Persian army's southward march would inevitably have to pass through a narrow coastal pass known as the Thermopylae. After much deliberation, the Hellenic alliance decided to make its stand there. This decision had three objectives. First, if they could use the terrain to defeat the enemy, that would be ideal. If not, the second objective was to delay the Persian advance, buying precious time for Athens and the southern states to prepare for war. The final objective was to bolster morale. To flee south without firing a single arrow would have been calamitous for the alliance's spirit. Looking across all of Hellas, only one state could be entrusted with such a task: Sparta. The Spartan king, Leonidas I, simply nodded and said, "We will do it." He led 298 of his finest warriors to hold the pass at Thermopylae, facing the overwhelming tide of nearly 100,000 Persian soldiers. These 299 Spartans held their ground for 3 full days. After 3 days, the Persians, battered, humiliated, and having suffered heavy casualties, were incandescent with rage. They began rounding up local Hellenes. Finally, one of them, a man named Hephaestus, whether he broke under torture or was swayed by a Persian enticement, we can only speculate, confessed. He revealed that there was a hidden path near Thermopylae, a way to circle behind and attack the Spartans from the rear. With this, the Spartans' terrain advantage vanished. 300 against 100,000. The outcome was as brutal as it was inevitable. All the Spartan warriors were killed. Their leader, Leonidas I, was decapitated, and his body was ignominiously crucified. The cross had no religious connotation at this time. It was simply a brutal form of punishment used by ancient Babylonians, Persians, Hellenes, Romans, and even the Kingdom of Israel for the most heinous of criminals. Why it later became associated with Christianity is a story for another time. Now, this is the story of the 300 Spartans, as it is told in history books and popular culture, immortalized in various forms of art. The famous American films from 2006 and 2014 tell this very tale. But there is one detail we must not overlook: the numbers. In truth, Leonidas I did not aim just 299 Spartan warriors to Thermopylae. He was accompanied by 6,000 and allied Hellenic soldiers, and over 900 Helots, the serf class bound to Spartan service. However, if we examine history closely, this overlooked fact does not diminish the glorious image of Leonidas and his men. On the contrary, it makes their sacrifice all the more profound. Why? Because when the Persians discovered the weakness in the terrain, Leonidas I gave an order. All forces were to retreat, except for himself and his 298 warriors. This act of supreme sacrifice not only protected the retreating allied forces, but also struck a profound and chilling fear into the heart of Xerxes' I. As Leonidas' headless body swung from the cross, the still shaken Xerxes was seen muttering to himself, "Like a man possessed. Are all Spartans like this? Are they? Are they?" The implication was clear. If all his foes were men of this caliber, what hope had he of victory? The ancient Hellenes later erected a monument at Thermopylae to commemorate these 300 true men. The epitaph reads, "Go tell the Lacedaemonians, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." Lacedaemon is another name for Sparta, much as the Chinese might call themselves the descendants of Yan and Huang. Not one of them brought shame upon Sparta. This, of course, is a result of a militaristic education. Without that iron-will belief that sacrifice for one's country is the highest glory, there can be no courage to face 100,000 enemies with such defiance. It is said that a Spartan mother, when her son was about to go to war, would give him his shield with the words "return with it," or on it. With the pass taken, the Persian army marched triumphantly towards Athens, but when they arrived, they found an empty city. The Athenian general Themistocles and evacuated every single resident to the island of Salamis in the Saronic Gulf. He had also gathered the entire Hellenic fleet in the Strait of Salamis, preparing for a decisive naval engagement with the Persians. The Persians were incensed. They had come for treasure, people, and livestock. What was the meaning of leaving them a pile of rubble? Did they think the Persians were short of timber for building houses? Upon inquiry, they learned the Athenians had taken to the sea. Well, what were they waiting for? One word: pursue. During the pursuit, they received further intelligence. The Hellenic alliance was fractured, with many wanting to surrender to the great Persian Empire. Xerxes, I laugh from the bottom of his heart. He ordered his entire navy, more than 600 massive warships, to converge on the Strait of Salamis, preparing to annihilate the Athenian fleet in a single blow. But the old fool did not know that every piece of intelligence he received was exactly what Themistocles wanted him to receive. What does that mean? It means the Hellenic navy wanted the Persian fleet to come to the Strait of Salamis. The reason for this was not that the Hellenes had more ships, nor that their ships were larger. In fact, it was the exact opposite. The allied Hellenic fleet had only 300 warships, half the number of the Persian navy. The Hellenic ships were less than half the size of the Persian vessels. They were miniature by comparison. This raises a question. Was Themistocles mad? Outmatched in every way, why would he seek a decisive naval battle? The secret lies in those very words. The Hellenic ships were small. The situation was this: the waters of the Strait of Salamis were deep enough, but the strait itself was filled with narrow channels. For a large ship, even turning around was a major problem. One wrong turn and crash. You're into a tiff. If you were lucky, you'd be frantically bailing out water to repair your ship. If you were unlucky, you'd be in submarine mode. So it was. Due to Xerxes' lack of geographical knowledge, he was outmaneuvered by the Hellenic alliance. After losing nearly 300 warships, the Persian Empire fled back to Asia Minor in disgrace. The Hellenes had won a great victory in what became known as the Battle of Salamis. Xerxes had not given up completely. On land, in the north, there were still 60 to 70,000 Persian soldiers marching south. And it was common knowledge that the Athenians were no match for the Persians on land. So, although Xerxes had fled back to Asia Minor, he was still watching with wide eyes, anticipating a great Persian victory on the mainland. Fortunately, there was still Sparta. In the summer of 479 BCE, Sparta and the Hellenic alliance marched to Peloponnesian in northern Hellas. This time, Sparta fielded what was perhaps the largest armed force in its history, 10,000 Spartan soldiers, plus 35,000 helots. If you think the number isn't very impressive, remember Thermopylae. That was only 300 Spartans. This was 10,000. The battle began on the 11th day of a tense standoff. For the Persians, the outcome was tragic. Nardan Ayas, the Persian supreme commander, who had participated in both Greco-Persian wars, was cut down from his horse and died at his post. As for the Persian army's casualties, the battle report consists of just 4 words. The entire army was annihilated. But how many was the entire army? Historians do not have an exact figure. The 2 most authoritative ancient Hellenic historians, Herodotus and Diodorus, give figures of 100,000 and 250,000, respectively. Modern historians generally believe both were exaggerating on behalf of the Hellenes and belittling the Persians. We will use the estimate derived from modern historical research, around 70,000 men. The Battle of Salamis and the Battle of Peloponnesian. These 2 great battles completely shattered the Persian invasion power. In fact, they did more than that. They ignited the ambitions of the Hellenes. They looked across the Aegean Sea towards Ionia and the Black Sea coast and thought, those used to be our colonies. Since we can defeat the Persians, why not take them back? And so, Hellas and Persia entered a new era. Hellas began its counterattack. This counterattack was both fierce and swift. The day after the Battle of Peloponnesian, in 478 BCE, the Athenian navy crossed the Aegean Sea and began its campaign in the Ionian region. Within a year, all the city-states in Ionia with ties to Hellas had broken away from Persian rule and re-allied with the Hellenes. Among these liberated city-states was, of course, Miletus, the one that had started the rebellion against the Persians in the first place. Strictly speaking, Miletus, located on the southwestern corner of modern-day Turkey and facing Athens, across the sea, was not founded by the Hellenes. It was established around 1500 BCE by a group of migrants from the island of Crete, who gradually became a city-state affiliated with Hellas. Today, when we mention Miletus, we often add towards the school. The Milesian school, Do not underestimate these words. They represent something very simple, the starting point of Western philosophy. In other words, modern Westerners unanimously agree that philosophy, as a discipline, was born in Miletus. So, how was it born? This brings us to a man named Thales, born in 624 BCE. Thales is now regarded as the father of Western science and philosophy, and the founder of the Milesian school. But we must point out that Thales was not, in fact, European. Miletus, his home, was in Asia. And we must also stress that in ancient Europe, philosophy and science were not distinguished. Philosophy was science, and science was philosophy. This is completely different from the modern view, where the two are drifting further and further apart. As for how they separated, we will discuss that later. So, why did Thales earn such a lofty title? The reason is simple. Unlike the superstitious Hellenes of his time, Thales refused to explain natural phenomena through theology. For example, if there was an earthquake, the average Hellene would explain, "Oh my, the gods are fighting again." But Thales would say, "No, that's not right. It's because the earth floats on water, and when the waves get too rough, we on land feel the tremors." According to Herodotus's histories, he also accurately predicted the solar eclipse of May 28, 585 BCE, confirmed that the Little Bear constellation could help sailors determine direction, and was the first Hellene to fix the length of a year at 365 days. He eventually posed a question: what is the fundamental substance of all things? The moment he asked this question, he was elevated to the status of a philosopher, and one of the greatest at that, because this question is precisely the most fundamental, most perplexing, and most fascinating question in all of philosophy. So, we must ask, what is philosophy? There is no single answer to this question. Or rather, the answers are so varied that there is no unified standard. However, I personally believe that a quote from the British philosopher Bertrand Russell offers perhaps the best explanation. He said, "Philosophy is something intermediate between theology and science. It is a no man's land, exposed to attack from both sides." This statement has at least 3 layers of meaning. First, philosophy is not science. In other words, it cannot be confined to known systems of knowledge. It must leap beyond all modern systems, including science, to find new solutions and ideas for humanity's unanswered questions. Second, philosophy has no connection to religion, gods, or ghosts. Although it is a form of freewheeling thought, its starting point is rational and logical, and it demands logical consistency. To simply declare, "It is the will of heaven," and fall to your knees in prayer is not the philosophical approach. Third, although the 2 great pillars that have supported European history formal, science and theology, both originated from philosophy, neither of them likes philosophy very much. Science considers it mystical nonsense, while theology considers it disrespectful to the gods. Moreover, philosophy itself is often unsteady on its feet, sometimes stumbling into the realm of science, and sometimes into the realm of theology. So it's no surprise that it is attacked from all sides. In fact, if we go by the original Greek meaning, philosophy is simply the love of wisdom, and a philosopher is a lover of wisdom. For a lover of wisdom, to question existing doctrines, to refuse to worship any god or emperor, is a natural thing. Similarly, for these lovers of wisdom, questions that science dares not speculate on, and that theology speculates on wildly, like, what is the fundamental nature of all things, are their favorite kind of questions. So, what did Thales of the Milesian school, the progenitor of Western philosophy, believe was the fundamental nature of all things? His answer was water. In other words, not just women, but everything on earth is made of water. Its essence is water. Those with a little knowledge of Chinese philosophy will immediately slap their thighs and say, "My goodness, during the spring and autumn period, that fellow Guanzong said the same thing." Yes, Guanzi, who lived about 100 years before Thales, once stated, "What is water? It is the origin of all things, the ancestor of all life." Of course, to say that Thales plagiarized Guanzi is certainly not the case. There were no mobile phones or internet, but then you couldn't copy, even if you wanted to. Here, I'll mention something in passing. Because of my work on Chinese history, I am often asked a question, what is wrong with China? My answer is simple. There is no civilization in this world without philosophy. As soon as people have full stomachs and find themselves gazing at the starry sky at night with nothing to do, they will start to worry about the kind of full stomach problems that only philosophy addresses. Western society often attributes its current civilization to its ancestral culture, that is, the philosophy of ancient Hellas. This is why some people try to convince you that philosophy exists only in Europe and nowhere else. You can listen to this, but it's just like us. They're just trying to make their ancestors seem more impressive, to have better stories to tell when they're drinking. After Thales, Hellenic philosophers continued to explore the question of the fundamental nature of all things, proposing different theories. For example, Anaximenes, also from Miletus, said that all things are made of air. Heraclitus said it was fire, and Pythagoras said it was number, the number from mathematics. Another philosopher, Democritus, from some unknown city-state on the northern Aegean coast, slapped his thigh and said, "Stop talking nonsense, all of you. This world is made of atoms and the void." Democritus brilliantly summarized the properties of atoms, saying they were things so small you couldn't see them and couldn't divide them. These things move in the void, and because of their different movements, they manifest in different forms. Moreover, atoms are like people. They get lonely, they seek partners, they hook up with other atoms to form different substances. To be fair, old Democritus's theory is not only as late as later atomic theory, but even by today's standards, it is not outdated in its general direction. It even sounds a bit like the latest string theory. And you have to know, string theory is something humanity only proposed about 50 years ago. But if you were to say, wow, old Democritus was brilliant, that's not necessarily true, because modern historical research shows that his near contemporary in ancient China, Mozi, proposed a theory of atomices at almost the same time. In Moses' writings, he states that if you keep dividing a substance in half, you will eventually reach a point where it cannot be divided further. This he called the Dwan, or endpoint. Moses' theories were not limited to matter. He also proposed the smallest unit of time, which he called Shijian, a unit of time that could not be further divided. And Moses even said things like, space is contained within time and is longer than eternity. The brilliance of this statement lies in its revelation that the motion of matter involves both space and time, possibly the earliest concept of space-time. You might say again, wow, Moses was brilliant. Well, actually, before Moses, the founder of Jainism in ancient India, Vardh Amana, revered by his followers as Mahavira, had already proposed atomic theory in the 6th century BCE, calling the particles paramonu. He was even more brilliant. But whether it was Moses or Mahavira, no one in China or India later inherited their theories, and they were gradually forgotten. But let's get back to our main topic. Democritus is now widely recognized as the originator of atomic theory. Similarly, another concept not first created by the Hellenes, but for which they receive the credit, is the Pythagorean theorem. Pythagoras was the man mentioned earlier who believed the world's fundamental substance was number. He was born in 570 BCE on the island of Samos, near Miletus. I personally find his idea that the world's essence is number even more stunning than Democritus's atomic theory. Especially after watching The Matrix, the cascading streams of numbers on the screen always remind me of old Pythagoras. How did he know the world was virtual? But what old Pythagoras is best known for is the Pythagorean theorem, known in China as the Go-Ugu theorem. The square of the hypotenuse of a right-angled triangle is equal to the sum of the squares of the other two sides. We should note that about 500 years before old Pythagoras discovered this theorem, around 1000 BC, Shangao of the Zhou dynasty in China had already discovered the Go-Ugu theorem. Shangao was a contemporary of the Duke of Zhou, but just like with Moses, if you were to say, so the Chinese were more brilliant, you'd be wrong again. The ancient Egyptians had already recorded the smallest Pythagorean triple, 3 or 5, on papiers as early as 2600 BC. But at this point, the people of Mesopotamia, long since ascended to the heavens, would surely snap and say, "What's that?" Before we disappeared, we recorded a very large Pythagorean triple on a clay tablet 12,709, 13,500, and 18,541, which perfectly fits the theorem. And this was such a small matter that it wasn't even worth mentioning, so the ancestors who recorded these numbers didn't even bother to leave their names. I mention these things not to belittle old Pythagoras, but simply to illustrate, and although the theorem is now named after him, it was already common knowledge throughout the world in his time. That is a fact. However, another of old Pythagoras' achievements, being the first to propose that the earth is a sphere, is something no one can contest. He can be very proud of that. There is a common feature among the philosophers I just introduced. Not a single one of them came from the most democratic city-state of ancient Hellas, Athens. They were all from outside Athens. You could even say they were all from the Hellenic colonies near Asia Minor, specifically near Miletus. So where was Athens? Why were there no philosophers? Well, Athens did have philosophers. They just came along a bit later than the ones we mentioned. And the story begins when Hellas entered its counterattack phase in the Greco-Persian Wars. From that point on, Athens entered a golden age. This period lasted from about 480 BCE to around 400 BCE, and is known as the Golden Age of Athens, or the Age of Pericles. Pericles was born around 495 BCE. His father was a commander in the Athenian navy, and his mother was the niece of the Athenian reformer Caesius, whom we've mentioned before. This was a fine aristocratic family, so Pericles received an excellent education from a young age. For example, one of his teachers was the famous ancient Hellenic sophist philosopher Zeno of Elea. Elea was a coastal city on the Italian peninsula, a Hellenic colony at the time. This teacher, Zeno, proposed a famous paradox called Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles was a famous hero of the Trojan War, known as the greatest warrior in Hellas. His physique was top-notch. How could he not catch a tortoise? Zeno would say, come, let me prove it to you. Let's assume the tortoise has a 50-meter head start on Achilles. Before he can catch the tortoise, he has to run that 50 meters, right? But the problem is, the tortoise is also crawling. That's slow. But in the time it takes Achilles to run 50 meters, it has moved forward another 5 meters. So doesn't Achilles have to run that 5 meters now? But after he runs that 5 meters, the tortoise has still moved forward a little bit. And so on and so forth. Many fool knows, but what Zeno described is impossible. He wasn't just showing off, he was using this story to explore the relationship between motion and stillness. In other words, his methods were extremely effective in debate and oratory. Just imagine Pericles grew up studying with people like this, people who could tire your brain and not at a moment's notice. What kind of person would he turn out to be? Sure enough, when he grew up, the man became a famous orator. He was also an excellent speaker and sophist, his eloquence no less than his teachers. But at the same time, he was an honest and dedicated public servant, a resolute and calm general. Generally, we call such a person an outstanding statesman. In 461 BC, the then leader of Athens, the conservative Cimon, was exiled by the Athenian assembly. From this point on, Pericles, representing the democratic faction, began to rise to prominence in Athens, gradually becoming a key leader of the Athenian government. We mention that during the reforms of Pericles' grandfather, Caesius, Athens established a committee called the Council of 10 Generals. Each of the 10 tribes of Athens elected one person, making it the highest military authority in Athens. But at the beginning, this committee had little power because Athens wasn't at war much back then. But After the great wars with the Persians, the power of this committee gradually increased. Eventually, the position of the archons of Athens became less important than that of these generals. And whether a general was elected was decided by the entire Athenian assembly. The rule was one election per year, and they could be re-elected. Pericles was elected to the Council of 10 Generals every year from 443 BCE until his death. This earned him the title of First General. Whether this title actually existed at the time is debated by historians today. But there is no doubt that this man controlled Athens for several decades. Strictly speaking, the things he did were not numerous, but they were all quite important. The first was to strip the Areopagus, the council composed of Athenian nobles, of its power, and to transfer all decision-making power over the city-state's affairs to the Council of 500, the Citizens' Assembly, and the jury courts. Why? Because the Areopagus was purely an aristocratic organization, only traditional Athenian nobles could enter. The other three institutions were composed of citizens from all levels of Athens, either by lot or by election. This was called returning power to the people. The second thing he did was to pay salaries to public officials. Previously, Athenian civil servants had no salary, they all served the people for free. This meant that poor citizens simply did not want to and could not become civil servants. Now, it was much better. You could get a salary for being a civil servant, which greatly encouraged people's enthusiasm for public service. That was on the domestic front. In foreign affairs, Pericles strengthened Athens' role in the Delian League. What was the Delian League? It's simple. During the fight against the Persians, some city-states on the Hellenic peninsula held a meeting on an island called Delos. They said, "We must stand heart to heart and hand in hand to fight the Persians to the death. You either provided troops or your city-state provided military funds." At that time, most member states provided money, and Athens organized the army to fight the Persians. I must emphasize that this Delian League did not include any city-states from the Peloponnesian Peninsula. No one from the Peloponnesian League, led by the Spartans, joined this Delian League. This left a huge hidden danger for the future, which we will get to shortly. After Pericles came to power in Athens, he issued an order to move the treasury of the Delian League from the island of Delos to the city of Athens. The official reason was to prevent it from being stolen by thieves. But, in reality, he used this money to arm Athens and to renovate the world-famous Parthenon. This place was where the ancient Hellenists worshipped the goddess Athena, and today it can almost represent Hellas itself. Pictures of it are all over the internet. Pericles believed that the goddess should be shown sufficient respect, and this respect was reflected in the size of her temple. As for using the Delian League's money to build a temple for the Athenians, well, the goddess should be happy about that too. My child, my name is Athena. Of course, Athens is the most important. What does the Delian League matter? In any case, during Pericles' rule, all aspects of Athens were indeed strengthened, which eventually gave rise to many philosophers, scientists, writers, otherists who would be famous for generations. Here, let's first introduce a writer and a historians Sophocles and Herodotus. Sophocles was born in 497 BCE in a small village outside Athens. It was a village, but his family was of a landlord, bully, rich, peasant type. So, not only did he not suffer any hardship as a child, but he also received a good education. At the age of 55, he was promoted to be one of the treasurers of the Dalai League, and he was elected to the Council of 10 Generals 3 times. He finally died at the age of 90th. It was a life of such happiness, it was almost obscene. His contemporary, the famous ancient Hellenic comedy writer Aristophanes, once praised Sophocles' life with drool on his chin, saying he was fulfilled in life and without regret in death. But he would never guess that this pampered young master from a landlord's family would be remembered in history for the tragedies he wrote. He, along with Aeschylus and Euripides, is known as one of the 3 great tragic poets of ancient Hellas, and he is undoubtedly the first among them. He participated in 30 drama competitions in his life and was the champion 24 times. Each time, he made the audience cry their eyes out. Let's look at his masterpiece, Oedipus Rex. The story goes that Laius, the king of the Hellenic city-state of Thebes, was cursed with a prophecy that his son, Oedipus, would one day cut off his head and marry his wife, tell his father, and marry his mother. The king was scared to death. "What kind of monstrous thing is this?" he said. "Get rid of it immediately." So he had the infant Oedipus abandoned in the wild. But little Oedipus did not die. He was adopted by the king of another city-state, Corinth, and raised as his own son. Oedipus, of course, believed that the king of Corinth was his real father. When Oedipus grew up, he one day happened to hear the oracle of the sun god Apollo, which said that he would one day kill his father and marry his mother. Oedipus, who was kind, upright, and valued family ties immensely, decided to go into exile. He thought, "If I never see my father again, I certainly can't kill him." You can guess the ending. Die, be twist of fate. Oedipus met his real father, Laius of Thebes. The story doesn't end there. The city-state of Thebes was, at that time, being plagued by the famous Sphinx, a monster with the body of a lion and the head of a woman. This monster blocked the main road, said that anyone who passed must answer her riddle. Was they could answer it, they could kill her. Otherwise, she would eat them. The people of Thebes were being eaten one after another. Finally, the whole city offered a reward. Whoever could defeat the Sphinx could marry King Laius' widow, that is, Oedipus's own mother, and become the new king of Thebes. The Sphinx's riddle was this: what animal walks on 4 legs in the morning, 2 legs at noon, and 3 legs in the evening? And when it has the most legs, it is also at its slowest. And Oedipus guessed it. The answer is man, because we humans crawl on all fours as infants, which is also when we are weakest. When we get old, we need a cane, so we walk on 3 legs. When the Sphinx heard this answer, she had nothing to say and threw herself into the sea and died. Subsequently, Oedipus married his own mother and had 4 children with her, creating a human tragedy. We say that the tragedy of Oedipus Rex is a very typical heroic tragedy and also a tragedy of fate. This kind of tragedy is fundamentally different from the moral tragedies that became Peloponnesian. What is a moral tragedy? It's when a good person is harmed by a bad person. But in a tragedy of fate, there is no strict distinction between good and bad people. It emphasizes the helplessness of life and the irresistibility of fate. Compared to moral tragedy, its impact on the soul is many times greater and much more profound. This is why the things written by this landlord's son, Sophocles, can shock both ancient Hellenes and modern people. The tragedy of fate transcends time and race. Another figure, the historian Herodotus, although not an Athenian, traveled extensively throughout his life, visiting Mesopotamia, the Crimean Peninsula, the plains along the Black Sea coast, ancient Egypt, Sicily, and many other places. And Athens was his favorite city, and the one where he stayed the longest. Till in Athens, he had very pleasant conversations with Pericles' family. It was only because he was not an Athenian that he could not obtain Athenian citizenship. Finally, in 44 BC, he came to the Italian peninsula and became a member of an Athenian overseas colony. After that, there is no news of him, whether he ascended to heaven or simply vanished. We do not know. We mention, when talking about Chinese history, that Sima Qian also traveled extensively in his youth, which gave him a broad knowledge that laid the foundation for writing the records of the grand historian. Herodotus was the Sima Qian of Athens. And customs of the ancient Hellenic city-states, the Persian Empire of the time, the Near East, the Middle East, and other places. Most importantly, he devoted a large amount of space to a complete record of the Greco-Persian Wars. This is also the main historical source for our previous account of the wars between Hellas and Persia, the Battle of Marathon, the Battle of Thermopylae, the Battle of Salamis Bay, and so on, all come from this book. Either way, the word democracy that we use today was first formally proposed by Herodotus in his book The Histories. The word contains 2 roots: demos, meaning people, and kratos, meaning rule. So the original meaning of democracy is ruled by the people. And Herodotus also said what he believed was the best form of democracy. Unlike Christians, it was drawing lots. Herodotus said that this was the only way to ensure the best fairness and justice for all people and to prevent the monopoly of interest groups. The Histories is the first relatively complete historical book in Europe. Although many scholars throughout history have questioned the authenticity of what Herodotus wrote, in recent years, many archaeological findings have indirectly proven that he was not talking nonsense. Most of the content is true. Therefore, more and more people have come to accept the statement of the ancient Roman Cicero, who said that Herodotus was the father of European history. Besides writers and historians, when we mention the great scholars of the Periclean age in Athens, there is one philosopher we must talk about. If I don't talk about him, I'll probably be despised to death by all of you. This man was 25 years younger than Pericles, but his fame was at least 25 times greater than Pericles's, who was so brilliant. When we talk about the most famous Hellene of the Periclean age in Athens, it is, of course, the old master Socrates. He, his student Plato, and his grand student Aristotle are known as the three great philosophers of Hellas. And Socrates alone is called the founder of Western philosophy. In fact, this old master, like Confucius in China, never wrote a single article. His deeds and words were all recorded by his disciples, Plato or Xenophon. Just like the Analects in China, besides not writing articles, Socrates, who was born in 470 BCE, 80 years after Confucius, was also quite similar to old master Confucius in many ways. For example, he also advocated educating his students by chatting with them. It's just that Confucius's chats were tailored to the student's ability, with patient guidance, while old Socrates' way of chatting was to challenge them directly, making you break out in a sweat after a series of counter-questions before you suddenly had an epiphany. His disciples Xenophon recorded such an incident in his memorabilia. There was a young man with an absolute moral obsession who was determined to go into politics. To educate him, Socrates specifically sought him out and asked him, "Is deception a just act?" The young man said, "Of course not." Socrates asked, "Then, if our general on the battlefield deceives the enemy's soldiers, and thus wins a victory, is that also unjust?" The young man was stunned and said, "I was talking about among our own people. We can't deceive each other." Socrates continued, "If our army's morale is low, and the general lies to everyone that reinforcements are coming, and then we turn defeat into victory, is this general also unjust?" The young man said, "Stop talking to me about war. We're talking about peacetime." Socrates just smiled. "When you were a child and sick, you were afraid of the bitter medicine and wouldn't take it. Your mother lied to you and said the medicine was sweet. You took it, got well, and lived to this day to debate with her. Was your mother also unjust?" The young man finally had to say, "I understand." His method of continuous counter-questioning, of constantly creating trouble for the other person, is now called the Socratic method. But we all know that educators all over the world, including the Buddha Shakyamuni, are very familiar with this method. Even my high school teacher often stared at me and shouted, "If you don't study, how will you support yourself when you grow up? Tell me." That's also a form of the Socratic method. It just didn't have much effect on me. According to his disciples' records, Socrates didn't seem to do much serious work in his life. Every day, he would just pull people into debates and speeches, constantly asking them all sorts of strange questions. One time, his wife got so angry that she yelled at him, and then, in front of many people, poured a bucket of dirty water on him. The old man wiped his face and said calmly, "I knew it would rain after the thunder. Where were we in our debate? Let's continue." If you ask why his wife was always arguing with him, the history books don't say, and his disciples don't say, but I think if you were his wife, and you had a husband like Socrates, who did no serious work all day, just drank with alums, boasted, and talked nonsense, and lived on the charity of those around him, or the government, you would also go crazy and feel that life was unbearable. It stands to reason that a man who couldn't turn enough money to satisfy his wife, but who also wore the great hat of the founder of Western philosophy, must have had many brilliant ideas. So what were his main philosophical achievements? I'm sorry, there really aren't any. We still can't say for sure what Socrates' philosophical ideas were. The world knows his Socratic method of teaching and his two famous sayings. One is, "The only thing I know is that I know nothing," and the other is, "Knowledge is virtue." But besides that, we really can't be sure what else he had. And to be objective, the first of his two famous sayings was very annoying to the Athenians of his time, because the real meaning of what old Socrates was saying was this: we are all ignorant. It's just that I admit I'm ignorant, while you don't even know you're ignorant. In other words, you people are no different from fools. Just imagine the scene. After he had debated his opponent into silence, he would coolly leave them with the line, "I'm actually very ignorant," and then turn and walk away. If you were his opponent, wouldn't you be driven mad with anger? So, why is Socrates so famous in later generations? I think there are three reasons. The first is that he died a spectacular death, which we'll talk about in a moment. The second is that in an age when most people still worshipped gods, his thirst for knowledge and his emphasis on critical thinking, logic, and reason were indeed very rare and valuable. These are the things that European society valued most during the Renaissance after the Middle Ages. When they learned that this ancestor, old Socrates, had done this long ago, they naturally felt it was very impressive and insisted on upholding him. A last point is also very important. Like Confucius and Jesus, this man had some very, very brilliant disciples. Of course, Socrates not only had disciples, but also an extremely brilliant grand disciple. The most brilliant of his disciples was named Plato, and the brilliant grand disciple was named Aristotle. But we'll talk about Aristotle's story when we get to Alexander the Great. Here, let's first talk about Plato. He was also an Athenian, born in 429 BC. Ancient Hellas was the same as ancient China. They also had auspicious signs for particularly famous people. It is said that when Plato was still an infant, bees, following the will of the gods, would often land on his lips. So when this man grew up, speaking with great clarity, and unlike his teacher's annoying way of talking, people who listened to Plato's speeches all felt that this man was right in words, sincerely convinced. The story of bees landing on little Plato's lips, even if it happened, could well have been another version. That is, he had an incredibly lazy mother who never wiped his mouth after feeding him, just put the child in the sun and went off to play mahjong herself. So, how brilliant was this man Plato? There is a saying in Western philosophy that all of philosophy for the past 2,000 years has just been footnotes to Plato. His extant works that are now confirmed, or rather, have not yet been identified as forgeries, are the 35 dialogues. That is, he used a form of dialogue to express his personal ideas. And the main character in these dialogues is often his teacher, Socrates. This has led to two things. First, we can't distinguish which are Socrates' ideas and which are Plato's own private goods. Second, it makes Socrates look very brilliant. In these dialogues, the range of topics Plato covers is really quite broad. Health, politics, love, medicine, and so on. In a word, there was nothing this old master didn't know. I can give you an example off the top of my head. In his dialogues, he said, "What is a philosopher? He is a doctor who treats people's mental deficiencies." And with that snap, the modern Western term psychologist was born. Unlike Socrates, Plato did have his own philosophical propositions. The formal name is the theory of forms. Later, some people called it idealism or metaphysics. But I personally think we should still call it the theory of forms or Platonism. This theory is not complicated. It points out that our world is actually divided into two parts. One part is eternal and unchanging, perfect things, like the concept of a pig. It exists independently of time and space. The other part is the imperfect copies produced from this perfect thing. That is, all the specific, living, colorful, fat pigs in the world that can eat, sleep, root in the ground, and excrete in the eyes of us ordinary people. The former, that is, the perfect pig, is fake, an ideal, conceptual pig. And the latter, that is what is truly real, the fragrant, not too greasy braised pork on the table. The former is real, and the latter, those fat pigs running around, are illusory. They are fake. To explain this theory, the old master gave the following story, the famous allegory of the cave. There is a group of prisoners in a cave. Their hands and feet are bound, and they are facing away from the entrance. In front of them is a white wall, and behind them is a fire. As a result, these unfortunate people can only see the shadows of themselves and everything outside the cave on the white wall. These shadows are their understanding of the world and what they believe to be real. And everything real behind them, outside the cave, they do not know. They believe it does not exist. Plato used this story to tell everyone that people who do not understand philosophy can only see those shadows. And only philosophers have the courage to break free from their bonds, walk out of the cave, and, in the sunlight of truth, to understand real things, perhaps that perfect pig. From this, we can draw a conclusion. Most ordinary people are bound, ignorant, and foolish, because we are all cave prisoners. Therefore, Plato, in his Republic, naturally proposed the following vision for a state. He said that the best state is organized. Like this, the highest rulers should be philosophers who understand his Platonism. Citizens who understand nothing but a perish can be soldiers and warriors. Those who know nothing, have no courage, and only care about their wives, children, and warm homes, should all be laborers, farming the land to support the two types of people above them. In summary, One sentence, let the professionals do the professional work. And in Plato's mind, the most professional people to govern a country are philosophers. If you have listened to my talks on Chinese history, and you think about it carefully, apart from a hereditary monarchy, Plato's concept is quite similar to the state of Qin after Shang Yang's reforms. But for thousands of years, Shang Yang has often been criticized as a great villain of the Li school, while Plato is a philosopher on a pedestal. Why? There is only one reason Plato, apart from thinking about it, fantasizing about it, and writing an article, did nothing else. Speaking of doing nothing, people might think of the term platonic love. When I was young, society was generally against premarital relations, so I heard this term often. It refers to a spiritual love that pursues communication of the soul and rejects sexual desire. But, to be honest, if Plato had this term, he would probably be completely bewildered. When did I ever talk about truly spiritual love? A love where you can't engage in physical intimacy. Isn't that just playing games? In fact, the first person to propose the term platonic love was not Plato, but a philosopher of the Renaissance named Thrasina. So why did this guy use Plato's name? This is actually Plato's own fault. We said earlier that he believed the world was divided into two parts. Plato says that before we are born, we are all in that perfect world. But when you are born and come to this imperfect world, you are torn into two people. So, all our lives, we are looking for our other half. And this search requires a dialogue between souls. Physical communication can only be an auxiliary means. Under this theory, Thrasina defined purely spiritual love as platonic love. By the way, modern scholars have determined that it is highly probable that old Master Plato, who never married in his life, was talking about homosexuality when he said looking for the other half, not the heterosexual loves we understand today. Another thing worth mentioning about Plato is the Platonic Academy. This was a comprehensive school he founded in 387 BCE, north of Athens. It is considered the first university in European history. The site of this school was originally a cemetery, and the owner of this large tomb was named Academus. His greatest deed was that when Helen of Troy was a child and was abducted by Theseus, he was the first to see it and immediately ran to tell Helen's brothers. Because of this, he later became a hero, revered by the Hellenists, and his tomb became a regular meeting place for philosophers. So, Plato's school was initially called the Academy of Academus. In modern times, the English word academy comes from the name of this Academus. This academy existed for nearly 1,000 years, cultivating many talents, including Aristotle and Euclid. It was not until 529 CE that the Roman Emperor Justinian ordered the academy to be closed. Why he closed it, we will talk about later. The above are the general ideas and deeds of Socrates and Plato during the Periclean age in Hellas. We will talk about them again when we get to the Renaissance. Now, let's turn our attention back to the Athenian statesman, Pericles. We said earlier that Pericles' series of reforms were actually linked to authoritarianism, dictatorship, and so on. That is, his Percival had, in fact, already controlled the entire city of Athens. He said, "We will take back the league's money." And the Athenians cheered below, "Yes, take it back." As for whether there was anything wrong with this behavior, the Athenians were too lazy to think about it, because they all believed that Pericles was right. But what's strange is that countless historians have acknowledged that this great dictator, Pericles, also pushed Athene and democracy a big step forward. He forcefully stripped the nobles of their power, in form, returned his power to the Council of 500, which was chosen by lot from the people. Isn't this a victory for democracy? Well, that just shows he had ability and charisma. What's wrong with that? At the time, there was indeed someone who said something was wrong. The one who said something was wrong was a country, and that country was Sparta. This wrong was directed at both Pericles the man and the entire world, the entire D-line League of Athens. We said earlier that Sparta had always followed another path called oligarchy. The king and a few nobles had the final say. There was no council of 500, and certainly no citizens' assembly. This method of rule was not without its advantages. That is, Sparta was always militarily stronger than Athens, and its ability to mobilize and organize society was also superior to Athens. During the Greco-Persian Wars, Sparta was always the dominant power in the alliance on the Balkan Peninsula. But as Athens gradually built up the Dellene lead, and Pericles firmly grasped the power of the lead, uniting most of the forces he could unite, the threats of Athens to Sparta grew larger. This threat was not just Athens, his gradually strengthening military power, but also its encroachment on Sparta's sphere of influence. The hundreds of large and small city-states on the Balkan Peninsula had generally belonged to either the Dellene lead by Athens, or the Peloponnesian lead by Sparta. Seeing the number of member states in the Dellene League growing, Sparta was extremely anxious, even a little fearful. In 435 BCE, a conflict broke out between Corinth, a member of the Peloponnesian League, and its colony, Corcyra. Corcyra immediately turned to Athens for help. Athens immediately sent troops, forcing Corinth to retreat to its own territory. This was equivalent to Athens reaching into the Peloponnesian League, openly interfering in the internal affairs of Sparta's little brothers, Corcyra and the city-state of Corinth. This is very similar to the American Revolutionary War. Britain had a conflict with its colony, America. As a series of brilliant moves helped America become independent, completely breaking away from Britain. But a difference is, Britain had no big boss behind it. It was the big boss itself. But Corinth, a member of the Peloponnesian League, had another big boss behind it, a hegemon. And the traditionally most powerful military hegemon on the Balkan Peninsula, Sparta. Sparta could not just watch as Athens' Dellene League encroached on its sphere of influence step by step. In fact, as early as 460 BCE, Athens had secretly manipulated another Hellenic city-state, Megara, to switch from the Peloponnesian lead to the Delian lead. That time, the two sides fought for more than a decade, and it ended with Megara returning to Sparta's embrace, and the two sides signing a 30-year treaty. And now, the ink on the 30-year treaty was not yet dry, and Athens was starting trouble again, once again interfering in the internal affairs of the Peloponnesian lead. This was unbearable, and it wasn't just Corinth. By 400 Tito BCE, the de facto king of Athens, Pericles, had also issued the Megara, a decree, which said that whoever did business with Megara again would be an enemy of Athens. This is also the most fashionable practice of a certain great power today: embargoes plus economic sanctions. War funds' continuous efforts to divide the strike at Sparta's little brothers made Sparta burn with anger. And the embargo on Megara was even more salt in the wound for Sparta's fragile economy. It was equivalent to strangling Sparta and telling them to eat less and lose weight. So, Sparta immediately began its negotiations with Athens, demanding that they stop all hostile actions and dismiss Pericles from his post. It is conceivable that under the inspiration of the ambitious Pericles, Athens could not possibly accept such conditions. They flatly refused. At the same time, the envoy from Corinth gave a passionate and resounding speech in the Spartan assembly, saying, "If Sparta does not act, you will be held responsible for it, because it is you who have waited for the enemy to grow to twice its size without killing it in its infancy." Then the envoy said, "If we in Corinth do not receive outside help, we will suddenly withdraw from the Peloponnesian lead and turn to the great embrace of Athens." At this point, Sparta had only two choices. One was to watch its little brothers be bullied by Athens, and then have them leave and break away, while its own economy further deteriorated. The other was to break the blockade, save its own economy, and stand up for its little brothers. So how to stand up for them? Sparta was a state founded on military might. It didn't know diplomacy, but it was very good at flipping the table. And so, starting in 431 BCE, the famous Peloponnesian War broke out, lasting for 27 long years.